Preface and Introduction to Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War by Annie Wittenmyer. Preface. In preparing this little volume for publication, no attempt whatever has been made to record as facts of history the military movements of the Army during our recent Civil War. The great captains who led the Union forces through the terrible conflict from Fort Sumter to Appomattox have already covered, to a large extent, the military history of the war. My purpose has been simply to bring out in connection with these great military events, with which they were so intimately connected, a few of the many incidents and heart histories that were crowded into my own life, from April 20th, 1861, to November 23rd, 1865. The stories and reminiscences in this book are true to life, every one of them. They are told just as they occurred, without any attempt at literary embellishment, and most of them can be substantiated by living witnesses. Camps and hospitals were established near my own home in Keokuk, Iowa, early in April, 1861. I began at once my ministrations to the sick in these newly established hospitals, and during my daily visits, closed the eyes of the first Iowa soldier who died in the war. From that time on till the close of the war, I was actively engaged all along the lines. I was loyally and generously sustained by the women of Iowa; was elected by the Iowa legislature sanitary agent of the state; was commissioned by Iowa's grand old war governor, Samuel J. Kirkwood; was furnished by Secretary Stanton with a pass to all parts of the field, and government transportation for myself and supplies. This official order of Mr. Stanton's was supplemented by the following charge: "It is especially enjoined upon all officers to furnish this lady every facility in carrying out her generous purposes, it being shown that she is worthy of great respect." I had also the cooperation of the Sanitary and Christian Commissions, and the chief medical officers and government officials, so that I had unusual facilities for doing good. I was greatly indebted to General and Mrs. Grant for sympathy and aid. When Mrs. Grant was at her husband's headquarters the place was a haven of rest for me, and a welcome always awaited me. Indeed, Mrs. Grant would have joined me in the work, but her husband was afraid her strength and sympathies would be overtaxed. During these brief visits I learned to appreciate the unselfishness and noble qualities of General Grant, and the strength and purity of his character; and the loveliness and sterling worth of Mrs. Grant and her wifely devotion. I was also under great obligations to General John A. Logan, who was ever ready to aid me. When it was almost impossible to get from Bridgeport to Chattanooga, he sent me up in a little steamer which he loaded with my supplies. Later I met Mr. Orson, the president of the United Telegraph Association; and General Logan introduced me with such kindly appreciative words that without a hint from either of us, he filled out an order allowing me to telegraph free to the end of the war. I still have that little order in my possession. It is due our brave soldiers that I should say I felt as safe in their midst as I would have done in my own home, even though at times I was the only woman in the midst of an army of 20,000 fighting men, as was the case at Milliken's Bend after the repulse of General Sherman at Haines' Bluff. Not one impertinent or rude word was ever spoken to me in all those years. No purer or grander army ever marched to the music of fife and drum than the army that stood for the defense of our flag and the unity of our government from 1861 to 1865. A woman could walk in their midst in white, and a little child would have been as safe as in its mother's arms. As I was all along the lines from Vicksburg to Petersburg, and was on some of the bloodiest battlefields, and as I followed Sherman's army along the fiery lines from Chattanooga to Atlanta, I necessarily had to pass through many perils, and witness many exciting scenes. A few of these stories I have now thought best to publish. For more than 20 years my friends have urged their publication, but I shrank from the task because of their personal character. In giving these simple, true stories to the public, I shall hope that the same earnest, charitable spirit will be exercised by my readers as I manifested toward the sick and wounded during my army work. Annie Wittenmyer. Sanatoga, Pennsylvania, December 3rd, 1894. Introduction. The author of this most interesting and historic volume, Mrs. Annie Wittenmyer, I very often met whilst on my frequent visits to the headquarters of my husband, General Ulysses S. Grant. She there on her mission of mercy as she came to the front with supplies for the sick and wounded. I there simply to give the General a glimpse of his dear ones, some of the children being always with me. And I would gladly have joined Mrs. Wittenmyer in all her works of devotion. But the General forbade it, saying, when I returned from the hospitals laden with petitions and heart-breaking stories, "Julia, cease, cease! I cannot listen. I hear this all day, every day, and I must have some rest from all this sorrow and misery. If you insist on going again to the hospitals, I will have to send you home." Mrs. Wittenmyer was ever deeply interested in her efforts to relieve suffering, ever appealing for the discharge of the brave men who were made helpless by their wounds, ever braving dangers and enduring hardships in the performance of her self-assumed patriotic heart duties. I used to look upon this brave, heroic woman with profound respect and admiration, which, if it were possible, has grown the greater in the 30 years that have passed since then. Julia Dent Grant, 2108 R Street, Washington, D.C., November 27th, 1894. End of Preface and Introduction. Preface and Introduction to Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. Preface. In preparing this little volume for publication, no attempt whatever has been made to record as facts of history the military movements of the army during our recent Civil War. The great captains who led the Union forces through the terrible conflict from Fort Sumter to Appomattox have already covered, to a large extent, the military history of the war. My purpose has been simply to bring out in connection with these great military events, with which they were so intimately connected, a few of the many incidents and heart histories that were crowded into my own life, from April 20th, 1861, to November 23rd, 1865. The stories and reminiscences in this book are true to life, every one of them. They are told just as they occurred, without any attempt at literary embellishment, and most of them can be substantiated by living witnesses. Camps and hospitals were established near my own home in Keokuk, Iowa, early in April, 1861. I began at once my ministrations to the sick in these newly established hospitals, and during my daily visits, closed the eyes of the first Iowa soldier who died in the war. From that time on till the close of the war, I was actively engaged all along the lines. I was loyally and generously sustained by the women of Iowa; was elected by the Iowa legislature sanitary agent of the state; was commissioned by Iowa's grand old war governor, Samuel J. Kirkwood; was furnished by Secretary Stanton with a pass to all parts of the field, and government transportation for myself and supplies. This official order of Mr. Stanton's was supplemented by the following charge: "It is especially enjoined upon all officers to furnish this lady every facility in carrying out her generous purposes, it being shown that she is worthy of great respect." I had also the cooperation of the Sanitary and Christian Commissions, and the chief medical officers and government officials, so that I had unusual facilities for doing good. I was greatly indebted to General and Mrs. Grant for sympathy and aid. When Mrs. Grant was at her husband's headquarters the place was a haven of rest for me, and a welcome always awaited me. Indeed, Mrs. Grant would have joined me in the work, but her husband was afraid her strength and sympathies would be overtaxed. During these brief visits I learned to appreciate the unselfishness and noble qualities of General Grant, and the strength and purity of his character; and the loveliness and sterling worth of Mrs. Grant and her wifely devotion. I was also under great obligations to General John A. Logan, who was ever ready to aid me. When it was almost impossible to get from Bridgeport to Chattanooga, he sent me up in a little steamer which he loaded with my supplies. Later I met Mr. Orson, the president of the United Telegraph Association; and General Logan introduced me with such kindly appreciative words that without a hint from either of us, he filled out an order allowing me to telegraph free to the end of the war. I still have that little order in my possession. It is due our brave soldiers that I should say I felt as safe in their midst as I would have done in my own home, even though at times I was the only woman in the midst of an army of 20,000 fighting men, as was the case at Milliken's Bend after the repulse of General Sherman at Haines' Bluff. Not one impertinent or rude word was ever spoken to me in all those years. No purer or grander army ever marched to the music of fife and drum than the army that stood for the defense of our flag and the unity of our government from 1861 to 1865. A woman could walk in their midst in white, and a little child would have been as safe as in its mother's arms. As I was all along the lines from Vicksburg to Petersburg, and was on some of the bloodiest battlefields, and as I followed Sherman's army along the fiery lines from Chattanooga to Atlanta, I necessarily had to pass through many perils, and witness many exciting scenes. A few of these stories I have now thought best to publish. For more than 20 years my friends have urged their publication, but I shrank from the task because of their personal character. In giving these simple, true stories to the public, I shall hope that the same earnest, charitable spirit will be exercised by my readers as I manifested toward the sick and wounded during my army work. Annie Wittenmyer, Sanatoga, Pennsylvania, December 3, 1894. Introduction. The author of this most interesting and historic volume, Mrs. Annie Wittenmyer, I very often met whilst on my frequent visits to the headquarters of my husband, General Ulysses S. Grant. She there on her mission of mercy as she came to the front with supplies for the sick and wounded; I there simply to give the General a glimpse of his dear ones, some of the children being always with me. And I would gladly have joined Mrs. Wittenmyer in all her works of devotion; but the General forbade it, saying, when I returned from the hospitals laden with petitions and heart-breaking stories, "Julia, cease, cease! I cannot listen. I hear this all day, every day, and I must have some rest from all this sorrow and misery. If you insist on going again to the hospitals, I will have to send you home." Mrs. Wittenmyer was ever deeply interested in her efforts to relieve suffering, ever appealing for the discharge of the brave men who were made helpless by their wounds, ever braving dangers and enduring hardships in the performance of her self-assumed patriotic heart duties. I used to look upon this brave, heroic woman with profound respect and admiration, which, if it were possible, has grown the greater in the 30 years that have passed since then. Julia Dent Grant, 2108 R Street, Washington, D.C., November 27, 1894. End of Preface and Introduction. Section 1 of Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My first interview with General Grant. A large army had been thrown in and about Cairo, Illinois, and General S. R. Curtis of Iowa gave me a letter and a pass to go down and visit the hospitals there. General Grant was in command, with headquarters at Cairo. Fortunately for me I had friends at that point. The great hospitals were at Mound City, 6 miles above. I missed the boat that plied between the two places at irregular hours, and my friends proposed that we call upon General Grant. We found the modest, quiet, uncrowned hero busy at his desk, with his staff and orderlies about him. I was painfully conscious that I had no business of sufficient importance to warrant such an intrusion upon the man who stood between us and the army threatening that city at that hour. I had not thought of that before coming. But I felt very grateful to my friend, who came at once to my aid by explaining that I had come down from St. Louis to visit the hospitals, and was the bearer of a letter and pass from General Curtis, and that I also had a pass from General Fremont, and had merely called to pay my respects. We fell at once into pleasant conversation, and I found that the General was personally acquainted with friends and relatives of my own. "I will send you up to Mound City," he said. "Oh, don't trouble yourself. I can go up to morrow," I urged. But he was writing an order, and soon dispatched an orderly with it to Captain Somebody. Immediately my pride took alarm. What if he should send me to Mound City on one of those screaming, whistling little tugboats? "Have you met my medical director?" he asked. "No, I have not met him," I was forced to answer. "I will send him with you." And an orderly was dispatched to command his presence. Directly the boat was reported as ready. And the General himself accompanied me to the boat, the City of Memphis, the largest and finest steamer on the Mississippi River. The General simply said, "Take this lady to Mound City, and remain till she is ready to return. Wait for the medical director, and till I leave the boat." So I was for a little space of time the commander of the biggest steamer on the Mississippi River. As I walked the length of that great boat, so rich and gaudy in tinsel and curtains and furniture, the patriotic blood coursed hotly through my veins. Why this extravagance? Why this pomp and display? And when the medical director, who was supposed to be in charge of all the sick and dying in that great army, came in full military dress, with gloves and sash and sword and spurs, my heart sank down to zero. But I was not long in reaching the truth and changing my mind. A dozen boats or more had just been impressed into the United States service, and lay there at the wharf with steam up. They had not yet been dismantled, and it was the kindly proper thing to do to send me to Mound City, and it was military etiquette for the medical director to dress as he did. I was afterwards on the same boat many times, once after Sherman's defeat at Yazoo, when there were 750 wounded and sick soldiers on board. General Grant was just gathering these boats and these forces that he might move on Fort Donelson. We honor our grand old heroes, by Annie Wittenmyer. We honor our grand old heroes who stood in the thick of the fight, where deadly missiles were flying and valiantly fought for the right. They stood with God in the conflict, they fought on God's side in the fray. The Lord and his angels helped them, and freedom and right won the day. Sacred to freedom forever is the soil where they fought and bled. No bondsman shall wear a shackle, no tyrant shall lift up his head. Above the flags of all nations our beautiful banner floats high, its stars like the stars of heaven, and its blue as the sky. Long may it wave in its beauty, the symbol of freedom and right. Not a star be lost from its azure, not a blot stain its spotless white. A boy sent by express, C.O.D. In the winter of 1862, just before General Grant moved upon Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, I went out to Sedalia, Missouri, with a heavy load of supplies. Sedalia is 188 miles southwest of St. Louis, and was an important military station at that time. The people in that section were very disloyal and belligerent. The train on which I journeyed was fired into 3 times the day I made the journey, by bushwhackers, men who carried an irregular warfare. The train was well guarded. There were at least 50 well-armed Union soldiers on board to guard it, who took turns on the platform, ready to spring off, gun in hand, if the train were attacked. But when a volley was fired into the train before the engineer could stop it, and the soldiers could get started in pursuit, the enemy had mounted their horses and were far away. When the second volley crashed into the train, a bullet passed through the window beside me and whizzed very near to my eyes. If it had come a little closer, it would have gone through both of them. Fortunately, I had just leaned back against the seat; for if I had been sitting in an upright position, as I was a few moments before, the ball would have gone through my head. A mother and her little girl, who was 5 or 6 years old, sat in the seat in front of me. The poor little child was so terrified that she tried to hide under the seat. Her appeals, as she lifted her beautiful tear-stained face, were very touching. "Do you think they'll fire again, mamma?" "I hope not, my darling," and the mother would tenderly cover her with the skirts of her dress and try to soothe her. "Oh, mamma, do get down on the floor. If you don't, you might get killed." It was pitiful to see a child in such terror crouching on the floor. We did not reach Sedalia till midnight, and it was not till the train drew up at the station that the child could be comforted. The next morning early I went into the nearest hospital. The building was an old, dilapidated frame structure that had been used as a store. Scores of wounded and sick men were crowded into these poor, narrow quarters. But it is not my purpose just now to speak of them, or of the hospital management, but of a child I found there. He was lying on a cot in a little back room. They called him Willie. He said he was "goin' on 8," but if he was that old he was very small of his age. His face was wondrous fair and beautiful, and his hair hung in golden ringlets about his head. He had been very ill, and was still too weak to leave his bed; but he was bright and happy, and a great favourite with the men who, lying on their beds, whittled toys for Willie with their pocket knives out of anything they could utilize for that purpose, such as sticks and bones. I took a great deal of pains to ascertain the facts about the boy. He was a fatherless, motherless child, who had followed the soldiers when they marched away from the town where he was temporarily staying. No one cared, and no one followed to bring him back, and so he went on with them. The simple story, as he told it, seemed to be sustained by the facts I afterwards gathered. "I wanted to go to the war," he said. "I had no mother, and I did not want to stay at that place. I did not like the people, so when the soldiers went to the war I went too. Some of the men said that first day, 'Little boy, you had better run back home,' but I told them I had no home, that my mother was dead, and that I was not going back, that I was going to the war, so they put me in a wagon to ride. At night I had no place to sleep; but a man who said he had a little boy at home, about as big as me, said I could sleep with him, and he hugged me up under his blanket. Then after that I had a place in a wagon, the colonel said I might. Sometimes I rode on the horses behind the big officers; but they wouldn't let me go to fight. They made me stay back in the wagon. I didn't like that. I wanted to go to the fights." A few days after I found Willie I was in the hospital when a gentleman came in seeking some one. He was from Ohio. He happened to see Willie, and was wonderfully attracted to the child, and Willie seemed to take a great fancy to the gentleman. He came daily to see Willie during his stay in Sedalia. "This child," he said to me one day with tears in his eyes, "looks so much like my own boy, my only child, who died a few months ago, that I want to adopt him if my wife will consent. But her heart is so nearly broken by grief that she may shrink from the plan." I told him that I too had taken a great fancy to the boy, and had determined that he should have a good home, and that through my friend, General Curtis, who commanded at St. Louis, I should hold the boy till the best of references were furnished. To this he made no objections; and as soon as he reached St. Louis he sent the very best endorsements, furnishing the most ample evidence that he was in every way worthy of such a charge, as he was a wealthy Christian gentleman. Dr. Irwin, acting medical director, readily concurred, and it was agreed that if, when the boy was able to travel, they wanted him, he should be sent. Soon after he reached home a telegram came: "All right. Send Willie by express, C.O.D. Collect on delivery." When the contents of the telegram became known, there was great excitement among the patients. How could they part with Willie? And yet, as he was to have a good home, they rejoiced with Willie, who was delighted with the news that he was to go. As soon as he was able to travel, we prepared him for the journey. His name and address, and name and address of the gentleman to whom we were sending him, were written in ink on white muslin, and sewed to his coat and jacket, and on the shawl we wrapped about him, and on the blanket we bundled him up in. A stalwart expressman came for him, and after giving a regular receipt for him, took him up in his arms to carry him away. Dr. Irwin and the surgeons of the hospital, and even the nurses and cooks, all came to bid Willie good bye. His farewells were very touching. When he was carried from his little room out into the main ward, a few golden curls lay out on the folds of the coarse gray blanket, and his laughing eyes turned kindly from one to another as they called to him, "Good bye, Willie! Be a good boy, Willie! Don't forget me, Willie!" As we were about to pass through the last doorway, Willie, who had said "Good bye" to each one as they greeted him, called out at the top of his voice, "Good bye, everybody!" There was a chorus of good byes in response; but an Irishman by the door was heard above them all as he said, "Good luck to ye now!
and may ye live 100 years, and get into heaven afore the divil has a chance at ye."
We accompanied him to the train, the surgeons and myself, and saw him safely aboard with his luncheon; and we stood together in silence as the train pulled out, for a vacancy was felt in every heart. A telegram was received a few days later telling us that Willie had arrived safely. A great deal was crowded into the next few months. Battle after battle followed. Fort Henry and Fort Donelson had fallen, Nashville had surrendered, the bloody struggle at Pittsburgh Landing had taken place, and the Union forces had taken possession of Corinth, Mississippi. But Willie was not forgotten. The gentleman adopted him as his own child, and his wife was greatly comforted by the presence and love of little Willie. A perilous ride. In digging the ship canal across the point opposite Vicksburg, hundreds of men were killed or wounded in the great trench. By long practice the gunners on the bluffs of Vicksburg acquired the ability to drop a shell into the great ditch, causing terrible slaughter. The heavy guns of the Union forces answered the enemy's batteries but failed to silence them. Whistling Dick, as we all soon learned to call one great cannon used by the enemy, kept the music going night and day. The loud, clear, musical whistle which accompanied every discharge won for that gun the attention of all. Whistling Dick was a gun of long range, and was effective in execution, especially along the canal. But one day, after a loud, sharp whistle, there was an explosion, and Whistling Dick was heard no more. The work of death went on, however, for there were other effective guns, and the most determined resistance to the project of the Union troops was shown. The wounded soldiers were taken to a hospital hastily improvised at a point just opposite Vicksburg, where, although more than a mile nearer the enemy with only the Mississippi River between them, they were nevertheless comparatively safe, being protected by a high embankment. I had been sending supplies to this little hospital with lavish hand. It seemed dreadful that wounded men should lie there night and day under the guns of two armies, the battle always on, the shriek and thunder of shell and shot over them and all around them, and shaking the very earth on which they lay. Weary, homesick, and suffering, they were isolated from the army and from all other companionship, except that of the surgeon and his force of detailed soldiers. But this surgeon, I have forgotten his name or I would mention it with the highest respect, was a thoughtful and kind-hearted man, who desired the best for his men and heartily sympathized with them. One day he came into my quarters on the sanitary boat with a radiant face. He had thought of something which would please his boys, and that was that I should visit them. At first the thing seemed impossible. The distance was many miles. I could not go in an ambulance or on foot, and the dangers of the journey were appalling. But he had thought of all that, and explained the whole scheme. He could get a good safe horse, and I could ride on a cavalry saddle; and although there was some water in the canal, and the banks were steep, the crossing was entirely safe, and there were places where the horse could climb. I could not refuse to go to the men who had faced the cannon, and gone down wounded and helpless to the gates of death for my country and my flag. General Cyrus Bussey, who was afterwards the Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, and his plucky, lovely little wife, who is now among the glorified in heaven, volunteered to accompany me. Mrs. Bussey had her own horse and a side saddle. I had a great raw-boned animal which looked as though he had been in several wars, with a good new cavalry saddle, which some officer had kindly lent for the occasion. "This horse is good and safe," the surgeon explained, by way of apology. "They say he wouldn't shy or jump if a shell burst just before him." The guns of two armies were screaming over us when we reached the point which our guide designated as the safe place to cross the canal. He did not know that some of the barriers at the mouth of the canal had given way, and that the water in the canal was several feet deeper than when he had crossed that morning. The tide was swift and turbulent; but the surgeon said cheerfully, "It's perfectly safe. Just follow me." The next moment his horse went down into the muddy, swirling flood, and, struggling heroically, swam to the opposite shore. The surgeon called back to us that he had missed the crossing, and designated a point a little higher up, which, as he said, was perfectly safe. I had misgivings, but, settling myself well in the saddle, gave the horse loose rein. He marched bravely in, and went down into the flood with a plunge. General Bussy, fearing I would be drowned, spurred his horse in after me, and the two brave animals struggled together until we reached the opposite shore. Thanks to my Kentucky training, I kept the saddle, and the only damage done was a good drenching. As General Bussy expressed a wish that Mrs. Bussy should not attempt to cross, she remained at a cabin near by, which was somewhat protected, till we returned. Reaching the embankment opposite Vicksburg, we scattered, the surgeon taking the lead. I followed about 50 yards behind him, and General Bussy about 50 yards behind me. The road was fair, and we flew over that stretch at a full gallop. My shaggy, raw-boned steed made good time. It was a wild ride. We were surrounded by batteries. The mortar boats of the Union Army, placed as near to Vicksburg as possible, were sending their uncertain shells thundering over our heads into the doomed city with deafening fury. The heavy guns along the heights of Vicksburg were answering the long line of batteries and heavy mounted guns on our side of the river, and only the river lay between us and the enemy's works. Shot and shells screamed over us. Sometimes it seemed as if the sky was torn to pieces above us, but my horse did not flinch. On and on we went in a full gallop. If a gun was leveled at us that day from any of the near batteries, we were not in range when the shot came over, and so we reached the hospital in safety. What shall I say of this hospital? What can I say of these wounded, suffering men? Language is inadequate to describe their condition. Longing for home and mother, for human sympathy, their moans were answered only by the guns. They longed for quiet and sleep, but the guns of two armies were thundering night and day over their heads. How could flesh and blood, brain and nerve endure it? My garments were still dripping, but I went from cot to speak the words of cheer. The men tried to express their thanks for my coming in a befitting manner, but their "God bless you for coming" was choked with tears. As I saw those brave men lying there weak and helpless, and every nerve racked with the thunders of battle, I could not beat back my own tears. Indeed, as I live it all over again, and write of it, the tears will come again, although more than 30 years have rolled by since that time. I sobbed out as best I could, "God bless you, boys! Keep good courage! I will get you out of this if it is possible." The return trip was safely made. Again we swam the canal. Mrs. Bussy joined us, and we returned to camp. The next morning I called on General Grant, and reported the condition of these wounded men. General Grant was most thoughtful and careful of his sick and wounded. He took in the situation at once. Calling Rawlins, he said, "Those wounded men must be moved from the point right away. Send an order to the medical director to that effect." And that night, under the cover of the darkness, they were removed to hospitals at Milliken's Bend, 25 miles away from the belching batteries. A woman wounded in battle. A woman who had served as a private soldier in the ranks was severely wounded and taken prisoner at Chickamauga. She fell in a charge made upon the Confederates; and as the troops immediately fell back she was left with the other wounded on the field, in the enemy's lines. As she was dressed as the other soldiers were, her sex was not discovered till she was under a surgeon's care in the hospital. She was wounded in the thigh. No bones were broken, but it was a deep, ugly flesh wound, as if torn by a fragment of a shell. A day or two afterwards she was sent with a flag of truce into the Union lines. The sum and substance of the official message sent with this woman was, "As the Confederates do not use women in war, this woman, wounded in battle, is returned to you." There was great indignation in the regiment to which this woman belonged; and officers and men hastened to protest that, although she had been with them for more than a year, not one in the regiment suspicioned that she was a woman. She stood the long hard marches, did full duty on the picket line and in camp, and had fought well in all the battles in which the regiment took part. She was in the hospital at Chattanooga for some time, where I first met her. When she was able to bear the transportation, she was removed to a hospital at Nashville. I met her there again and again, and tried to ascertain why she had enlisted. "Had you a husband in the regiment?" I questioned. "No." A lover or friend? No, I didn't know any of them. Well, why did you enlist? I thought I'd like camp life, and I did. You did your full share of the hard work, I am told, marching, going on picket duty, and chopping wood. Yes, I was put on detail just like the others, and I never made any excuse. I was awfully afraid they would find me out, and then I'd have to go. But they did not find you out. No, not till I was wounded. The most I care about now is that they won't let me go back. Where did you come from? And what is your real name? I don't want to tell, and I shan't tell either. When she was able to sit up, the question of clothing became an important one. The surgeon said, "She must have women's clothes to put on." We women from the North, by gift and by purchase, provided the necessary outfit for a woman's wardrobe. To raise some funds for her we had her photograph taken, first in the uniform of a private soldier, and then dressed as a woman. She sold them to soldiers and visitors for 25 cents each, and raised considerable money. I have the two I purchased, which I have treasured in my war album all these years. She was stout and muscular, with heavy features, high cheekbones, and her black abundant hair was cut very close. She was perhaps 26 or 28 years old, but when in her military rig, looked like a beardless boy. The time came at last when she must be dismissed from the hospital, and I was commissioned by the officers to find out all I could about her, and where she lived, as she had been more friendly to me than to the others. The interview was a long one. I can give only the main points. "The time has come," I said, "when you must be sent out of the hospital. Where do you wish to go?" "I'll stay in Nashville," she answered. "But you can't stay in Nashville. This city is within the military lines, and no one can come in, stay here, or go out of this town without a pass. You have come into these lines in disguise as a soldier, but you are now known. So if you will not go willingly, you will be sent out in charge of a provost marshal. That is, you will be taken under arrest by the government officers to Louisville, and left there. Then what will you do? You are not strong enough to do hard work, and I doubt if you could get any work there to do. I'm awfully sorry I can't go back into the army." "You certainly cannot. The case is too well known, and recruiting officers have been warned, and will be on the lookout hereafter. If you will give your name and place of residence, the government will send you home, and the trip will not cost you anything." "If I tell you my name, and the place I wish to go, will you keep it a secret?" "I will be obliged to tell the officers." "Will you ask them not to publish it?" "I certainly will, and I will never tell it to anyone, except the officers from whom I will get the order for pass and transportation." "I will trust you," she said, and she whispered her name and residence. 2 days after that she was on her way to her home in the Northwest. I never knew what became of her. End of section 1. Section 2 of Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Braving Dangers. In December 1862, General W. T. Sherman gathered his forces at the landing at Helena, Arkansas, and on the 21st of the month, the great fleet, with flags flying, moved down the Mississippi River. A very strict order had been issued by him against any citizen or reporter accompanying the expedition, and severe penalties were threatened in case the order should be disobeyed. It was well known that the movement was against Vicksburg, but the bravest reporter feared to defy that order. As some time passed without news of Sherman's army, the Blue Wing was sent down with communications, but she was captured by the Confederates. The government finally decided to send down 2 gunboats and the White Cloud, a wooden steamer. I at once asked the privilege of loading the White Cloud with sanitary supplies. Mr. Plattenberg, agent of the Sanitary Commission, who was also at Helena, had a heavy load of supplies. As I had a pass for myself and all goods from the Secretary of War, I had no trouble in securing a passage on the White Cloud. I do not recall as to how Mr. Plattenberg secured the privilege of going with the little expedition. I only know that he went, and that the boat was loaded with our supplies. Thousands of soldiers were about the landing when our little fleet moved out with banners flying. We all knew that untold dangers were before us, and our heroism created the greatest enthusiasm. When the White Cloud moved out into the channel and turned her prow down stream, I stepped out "on the guards" to take a last look at Helena. My appearance was greeted with such an outburst of applause from the thousands on the wharf that I fled to the cabin, after waving my handkerchief in acknowledgment of the salute. We were fired into frequently from the banks. Whenever we reached a point of especial danger the White Cloud was sent 8 or 10 miles in advance so as to draw the enemy's fire, and thus uncover his batteries; for it was not likely that if the gunboats were in sight we would be attacked. Every moment, night and day, we were in expectation of shot or shell from some concealed battery from the shore; but they had been forewarned that the gunboats were coming, and so did not attempt to capture the White Cloud. The sharpshooters on the shore fired into us again and again. No one was killed, but sleep and rest were impossible, and there were many narrow escapes. We reached Milliken's Bend one morning about daylight, to find General Sherman's army quartered there. There was a great fleet of boats, and the sick and wounded were on them. A tugboat was detailed to me, and I went with my supplies from boat to boat, distributing such comforts and delicacies as I had to the men who had been wounded in the fight near Vicksburg. It was decided by the medical authorities to send a steamer up the river with a load of the wounded at once. The city of Memphis, the largest steamer on the Mississippi River, was selected for this purpose. A regiment and a battery were removed from the boat, and she was put in order; that is, the filth was shoveled overboard. I was told by a chaplain at the time that there were so many of our men dying that the firing of salutes over their graves was ordered discontinued. The constant noise of funerals was demoralizing. During the afternoon the boat was loaded up with the worst patients on the several boats. They were placed in the berths, and under the berths and on the floor and out upon the guards. Wherever there was a place where a fever-stricken or a torn and broken body could be laid, it was occupied. About 750 were put on board. The sun was sinking behind the long, low line of cypress trees, festooned with their trailing mosses, when our boat turned her prow up the Mississippi River. Long rows of men lay on the floor with their knapsacks for their pillows. Among them was a Missouri soldier, severely wounded and delirious, who all the night long called piteously for his sister. His cry, "Oh, sister!" was so plaintive and pathetic that I would go to him every little while and ask, "What do you want?" "I am glad you have come. I want a drink of water." When the water was given he would remain quiet for a little time. The next morning, as soon as it was light, he was taken to the amputating table, and one of his limbs sawed off above the knee. He sank very low under the operation, so low that no attempt was made to remove him from the table. The surgeon in charge said to me, "Get him to take some food or drink if you can. He is sinking very fast." I offered him every delicacy in my possession, but he turned away in disgust. There had been some of my supplies transferred to this boat. While working with the men on the lower deck, and helping dress their wounds, I found a barrel of sauerkraut. I allowed the attendants to open it; but afterwards, as I came up to the upper cabin, I called the surgeon's attention to it so as not to be blamed in the matter if the results were bad. It happened that I met him near the amputating table. As I passed the patient, I turned to give him a sympathetic look. He beckoned to me, and I hastened to him. "I want some kraut," he said. I stepped over to where the surgeon was ministering to a man, and questioned as to whether it was best to grant his request. "Give him anything he wants. He can't live anyway," was his answer. I sent an attendant down to get the kraut, and he brought a big tin cupful, and placed it on his breast and went his way. Shortly afterwards, passing that way, I noticed him, feebly, ravenously trailing the kraut to his mouth; and I never saw any one eat as much kraut as he did in my life. He never stopped till he emptied the cup. No one attempted to hinder him, as it was expected he would die soon. From that hour he began to mend, and by the time we reached St. Louis his case was considered hopeful. Months afterwards, as I was passing through one of the St. Louis hospitals, I heard the thud thud of crutches coming after me. I turned to see who was following me, and a merry voice greeted me. "Here's your sauerkraut man! Here's your sauerkraut man!" And there, sure enough, was my Missouri soldier, able to get around lively on crutches, and as blithe and merry as though he had never felt the keen edge of the surgeon's knife. The dangers and hardships of that trip can never be forgotten. There were many touching incidents. If this little story falls under the eyes of that Missouri soldier, I would like to hear from him. He told me that day that I last saw him his story, which was full of the pathos of home love and tender sacrifices. He was the youngest of his father's family, and they did not want to spare him to the country, though they were loyal to the Stars and Stripes. But the lawless bands of marauders who were significantly called "bushwhackers" were prowling over the state of Missouri, and his life was unsafe. He did not venture to sleep in a house for months before he left his home, and at last sleeping in the bushes became dangerous. Several times as he was asleep out in the undergrowth he narrowly escaped the bushwhackers, who were seeking him. I never saw him again, but hope he got back to his own home safely. During the trip up to Cairo 20 died, one with lockjaw. It was pitiful to see a great stalwart man deprived of the power of speech, starving to death. Not one particle of food could pass between his closely set teeth. His mind was clear, and daily he wrote out his requests in regard to his friends and other matters. Never was ocean traveler gladder to see the headlands of his own native country than we were to see Cairo. A company of ladies came on board, fresh nurses and surgeons were obtained, also comforts for the wounded in the shape of cots, mattresses, etc. Many of the patients were removed from the overcrowded boat into comfortable hospitals at Cairo, thus relieving all parties. As soon as the boat landed, I went to the house of a friend, and as I had not had 1 hour of unbroken sleep for about 10 days, I redeemed the time by taking a nap 36 hours long. 2 dreadful days on the battlefield. Shiloh. The hospital steamer on which myself and 2 other ladies took passage to Pittsburgh Landing from Cairo, Illinois, reaching Savannah, Tennessee, 8 miles below there, about 4:00 a.m., April 7th. There we heard the news of the terrible battle that had been fought the day before. Some said, "The Union army is defeated and driven to the very banks of the river, and are all likely to be captured today." We were soon out of our berths and on the outlook. The boat, with a full head of steam, made all possible speed to reach Pittsburgh Landing. 2 gunboats, the Tyler and the Lexington, lay out in the stream, sending shot and shell over the heads of the Union army into the Confederate ranks. As the boat steamed up to the landing, where already a great fleet of steamers was lying, the shells went screaming over our heads with deafening fury. All was in seeming confusion at the landing. The roadways dug out of the steep bank were insufficient for such an emergency. In the hard fight on the day before, a vast amount of ammunition had been used, and the officers all well knew that with the dawn of the coming day the battle would be renewed with desperate fury. Every teamster was, therefore, doing his utmost to get ammunition and provisions to the front. They would bring their mules to the steep, roadless bank that stood at an angle of 45 degrees; and while the driver held the lines with a strong, steady hand, and set his boot heels as to keep a standing position as he plowed his way to the bottom, his mules put their little front feet down, settled themselves on their haunches on which the wagon rested, and skeeted to the bottom with the driver. It was a wild sight. Each teamster had an assistant who held a torch made of pine. Hundreds of torches lighted up the black night. There was a clamor that cannot be described in the loading up, and a steady stream of loaded wagons going up the hill by the regular roadways. As soon as the first rays of the morning light made objects distinct, the firing began. Both armies had rested, face to face, on their arms, and a hasty breakfast had been snatched of what they could get before daylight, for all well knew that a bloody day was before them. For all knew what a bloody day was before them. Each man, as he lifted his head from the ground where he had pillowed it the night before, wondered if he should live to see the setting of another sun. Our hospital boat was lying alongside of other steamers. The rain was falling steadily. We could hear the heavy guns, the screaming of the shells, the thunder of the battle going on near by. As the light increased, we shivered to see the wounded lying on bags of grain and out on the guards, and the dead, who had been carried from the boats, lying mangled and bloody along the shore of the river. At first we could only cover our faces with our hands in a shiver and chill of agony, in the attempt to hide the horrid sights of war from our eyes. But as we stood there a feeble hand was lifted, and a feeble voice called out, "Say, lady, can't you bring me a drink of water?" Immediately 100 hands were lifted. We could scarcely see them in the faint light of the early morning, but we could hear the voices. "Bring me some water!" "Bring me something to eat!" I called out cheerily, "Yes, yes, we'll help you all we can." It was a great relief to have something to do. We went with gladness to our work. I was the pioneer, and went right on to the boat lying nearest. The surgeon in charge of our hospital boat had gone off to the field. There was no one in authority left on the boat, and we took possession. I had several boxes of canned oysters, and 3 or 4 barrels of crackers, but we soon exhausted these. Then we began on the beef in the storeroom. Barrels of soup were made and distributed. The other 2 ladies made the soup, and I distributed it from boat to boat, and from one to another. Oh, the sights and scenes I witnessed that day! As I was carrying a bucket of soup across a gangplank, an officer met me. He came bounding forward with his sword clanging by his side. "Madam," he said, "what are you doing?" I was startled nearly out of my wits, but I managed to say, "I am carrying soup to the wounded." "Why, you ought not to do that. See here, soldier, I detail you to carry soup for this woman." The soldier sprang forward and took the bucket of soup from my hand, and the officer went on. I never knew who he was. If this falls under his eyes, I want to thank him for his thoughtfulness. On and on all day I went with my assistant, while the 2 lady helpers worked as fast as they possibly could to get the food ready. The distribution of food was very rapid. Men with broken legs and arms and gashed faces would hold out their tin cups or canteens to be filled. The tin cups were easily filled, but the canteens took longer. When they saw us coming they would pound on the floor or on the side of the boat, calling piteously, "Don't pass me by! I am here, lady. Please give me some soup. Please, lady, pour some water on my arm. It is so dry and hot, and the wound hurts so." Without a moment's relaxation the day passed in this kind of work. In the afternoon the gunboat stopped firing, and the news came that the Confederates were driven back. Oh, how much that meant to us all! For through all that morning the boats had their full head of steam on, so that if the army was driven to the river as many as possible could escape by that means. Now and then I would help a surgeon who was dressing some of the worst wounds. My clothing was wet and muddy to the knees and covered with blood, but I did not see it. I had not eaten a mouthful of food since the night before, but I did not know it. I was entirely unconscious of weariness and human needs. It was about 10 o'clock at night when someone asked, "Did you have supper?" This little question called me to the consciousness of my condition. "No," I answered. "I have not had a mouthful to eat since yesterday evening." A surgeon operating near by looked at me earnestly, and then said, with the voice of authority, "Madam, stop work immediately. We will have you on our hands next." I was cutting a fragment of a blue blouse away from the arm of a wounded young soldier. I continued my work till the bits of the blouse were gotten out, as far as I could see, then laid on a wet compress. "Oh, thank you," he said, with grateful tears in his eyes. I went back to the cabin of the hospital boat and had my supper. After changing my clothes, I sat down on a divan, feeling almost too weak and exhausted to stir. A chaplain came on the boat inquiring for me. When he met me he seized my hand and began to bellow. I have never heard anything like it. When I saw him I knew that he was crazy. The officers of the boat ran back to see what was the matter, and somehow the surgeon in charge managed to get him into a stateroom and lock him in, and placed guards at the door, and the next day he was sent up with the other patients to St. Louis on the boat. Early the next morning I was transferred with the little baggage I had to another boat set aside for hospital workers. My fine dress, which I had worn for the first time the day before, was wet and muddy, and I pitched it into the river. Dr. Grinstead, now living in Washington City, was placed in charge of the boat. The Confederates had retreated toward Corinth, Mississippi, but there was still firing in the distance. Early in the day I went up the steep bank and out on the battlefield. The wounded had been gathered up as far as I could see, but many of the dead were still lying where they fell. Not far from the landing there were some tents. In one of these tents a son of Sam Houston of Texas lay on the ground with others, the gray and the blue lying together. Young Houston was severely wounded in the thigh. I talked with him kindly of his grand, loyal father, and ministered to him as best I could. I saw him many times afterwards, the last time a prisoner at Camp Douglas, near Chicago. If this by any possibility passes under his notice, and he has not forgotten my treatment of him when he was a wounded prisoner, I will be glad to hear from him. I went toward a house on the right, but before I reached it I saw two men coming, carrying a wounded soldier. They had made a seat by clasping their hands, and his arms were thrown about their necks. I went forward to meet them. "Oh, set me down by that tree! I can go no farther!" he cried. They carried him as tenderly as they could, and placed him between the great roots of a very large tree. His breast was bare, and the blood was slowly oozing out of a wound in his lungs. "I am dying," he said. "Can't somebody pray?" Both men were weeping. If he was not a brother, he was a friend. I answered promptly, "I can pray." I knelt there on the damp ground, and taking one of his hands in my own, I asked in simple words the Heavenly Father to forgive and bless. He responded to each petition. I kept on praying till he said, "The way is light now. I do not fear." There was a little gasp, a shiver, and all was still. As I knelt there I closed his eyes and said, "He is dead." "Yes," they answered with a sob. "He is dead, and this is all we can do. We will report the case and have the grave marked." And we turned away and left him there. An hour afterwards I returned that way. It was a most impressive sight to see a dead man sitting there so calmly and peacefully with eyes closed, dead and cold. When I passed that way again, they had taken him away. The country can never pay those who went out and heroically defended the flag. Such scenes as these bring gray hairs before their time to those who looked on. What must it have been to those in the midst of the fight? Johnny Clem, the drummer boy of Shiloh, and the boy hero of Chickamauga, Chattanooga. Johnny Clem, who lived at Newark, Ohio, was perhaps the youngest and smallest recruit in the Union Army. The Army historian Lossing says that he was probably the youngest person who ever bore arms in battle. He was born at Newark, Ohio, August 13, 1851, and his full name was John Winton Clem. He was of German-French descent, and the family spelled the name Klem and not Clem. His sister Lizzie, who is now Mrs. Adams, and lives on the Granville Road, near Newark, gives the following statement to a visitor. It being Sunday, May 24th, 1861, and the rebellion in progress, Johnny said at dinner table, "Father, I'd like mighty well to be a drummer boy. Can't I go into the Union Army?" "Tut, my boy, what nonsense! You are not 10 years old," was the father's reply, and he thought no more about it. When he disappeared he had no thought that he had gone into the service. That afternoon Johnny took charge of his sister Lizzie, 7 years old, and his little brother Louis, 5 years old, and took them to the Sunday school room, and left them there. As Johnny did not return, the father and stepmother were greatly distressed, fearing he had gone to the canal and gone in for a swim, for he was an expert swimmer, and had been drowned. They searched far and near to find him, and had the water drawn from the head of the canal that they might find his body, but all in vain. Several weeks passed before they heard from him, and then they got word, through a woman living at Mount Vernon, who had been a neighbor to them at Newark, that Johnny had been there, and that she had sent him home in care of the conductor. It seems that Johnny moved on the sympathies of the conductor, who took him on to Columbus, where he joined the 24th Ohio Regiment; but ascertaining that an uncle was in that regiment, he left it and joined the 22nd Michigan. He was an expert drummer, and being a bright, cheerful little fellow, he soon won his way into the confidence and affection of officers and men. He was in many battles, at Shiloh, Perryville, Murfreesboro, Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Nashville, and Kennesaw, and in other engagements in which the Army of the Cumberland took part. When he entered the army, being too young to be mustered in, he went to the regiment, the 22nd Michigan, as a volunteer, until the battle of Shiloh. When he was beating the long roll at the battle of Shiloh, a piece of shell struck his drum and sent it flying in fragments. He was after that called Johnny Shiloh. He was afterwards mustered in, and served also as a marker, and with his little musket so served on the battlefield of Chattanooga. At the close of that bloody day, the brigade in which he was, being partly surrounded by rebels, was retreating, when he, being unable to fall back as fast as the rest of the line, was singled out by a rebel colonel, who rode up to him with the summons, "Scoundrel, halt! Surrender, you little Yankee!" Johnny halted, and brought his gun into position as though he was about to surrender, thus throwing the colonel off his guard. In another moment the gun was cocked, fired, and the colonel fell dead from his horse. His regiment was pursued, and a volley was fired at that moment, and Johnny fell as though he had been killed, and lay there on the field until it was dark enough for him to slip away unnoticed. At Chickamauga he was struck with a fragment of a shell in the hip. He was taken prisoner with others while detailed to bring up a supply train from Bridgeport, Alabama. He fared hard as a prisoner. His sister, Mrs. Adams, says, "The rebels stripped him of everything, his clothes, his shoes, his little gun, an ordinary musket, I suppose, cut short, and his little cap. He said he did not care about anything but his cap. He did want to save that, and it hurt him sorely to part with it, for it had 3 bullet holes through it." When exchanged he was given a furlough, and sent home for a week. He was weak and emaciated from starvation, and his clothes were a bundle of rags. He had been absent about 2 years in the army, and was at that time in his 12th year. I did not meet him at Shiloh, but became acquainted with him at Chattanooga, when he was in the hospital there, and saw him frequently when he was on General Thomas's staff. He was a fair and beautiful child then, about 12 years old, but very small of his age. He was at that time only about 30 inches high, and